So there is a fascinating question that we need to explore. What if Satan was elected pope? This is not an abstract question. It actually is one of those questions that has real life application and consequences to things going on today in the church. And I'll explain how that is the case. And believe it or not, this really is a discussion that has taken place historically in the Catholic Church, and you'll see why here in just a moment. So that is what we are considering today. So, I had a commenter earlier, actually it was yesterday, leave a comment in the comment section, and they said this: the Catholic Faith Director, that is local parish community, flat out told me that if Satan himself became the Pope, we must submit to him. It disturbed me to my core, end quote. And I responded to this commenter. I said, are you aware that a saint and a doctor of the church in Catholicism actually said that? And that's likely what the priest is referring to there. And that too shook him to his core. That too caught him by surprise. I don't think he was aware of that. In fact, I don't think many people are aware that this has been a position that has been defended for quite some time. In fact, I can tell you from my own personal experience, anytime I've had a conversation with people about difficulties and problems with papal behavior, usually a common response that you'll get is, well, the gates of hell won't prevail. But another common one is, well, look, even saints have said, even if Satan were the Pope, we would have to follow the papacy. And again, that may come as a shock to you. And we're going to talk about both ends of this. Why would somebody say that? What are their reasons for arguing that kind of position? And what are the reasons for arguing the contrary? I mean, I think those are going to be a little bit more obvious, right, than the reasons in favor of that thesis. But we're going to talk about both of them. And then at the end, I'll give you some concluding thoughts on the matter. Okay, so where does this idea come from that, a saint and doctor of the church said that even if Satan were the Pope, you would have to follow his papal magisterium? That is from none other than St. Catherine of Siena. Let me share my screen and show you where she says this. So you should be able to see it right around now. Here's a quote from her. Even if the Pope were Satan incarnate, that is Satan in the flesh, we ought not to raise up our heads against him. That is, we ought not to disobey him, but calmly lie down to rest on his bosom. That imagery is interesting because, again, it was the beloved disciple in the Gospel of John who rests on his head on the bosom of Jesus, right? As a sign of closeness to Jesus and also trust. Here she's saying you would do that with Satan. So, I think that's going to raise some eyebrows, right? She continues, he who rebels against our Father, that is the Pope, is condemned to death. For that which we do to him, we must do to Christ. We honor Christ if we honor the Pope. We dishonor Christ if we dishonor the Pope. I know very well that many defend themselves by boasting. They are so corrupt and work all manner of evil. In other words, she's saying in her own day and age, a lot of people are saying, I'm not going to follow the Pope because of how corrupt they are, which is very true. Popes at that time, and certainly before, and even since then, many of them have been incredibly corrupt. We'll talk a little bit about that here in a moment. And here she's also referring to bishops and priests. They're so corrupt and work all manner of evil, but she's saying that's not an excuse. But God has commanded that even if the priests, the pastors, and Christ on earth, she's saying that the Pope is Christ on earth, as his vicar, the vicar of Christ. And Christ on earth, even if the pastors in Christ on earth were incarnate devils, we be obedient and subject to them, not for their sakes, but for the sake of God and out of obedience to him. So she's arguing not just the Pope, but if your local priest or your local bishop was a devil, was a demon holding that office, you got to follow them. Because if you don't follow them, you're not following Jesus, who set up that institution. And therefore, you're disobeying Jesus whenever you disobey Satan or the devil who occupies that office. That's the argument. And by following the devil and following Satan who occupies that office, you're actually following Jesus. Okay, so you can see the difficulty here, right? Very, very obviously. And then later on to the Florentines, who were also rebelling against Pope Gregory the 11th, because at this time there was a lot of rebellion and schisms and disputes with popes. She says, "He who rebels against our Father Christ on earth is condemned to death. For that which we do to him, we do to Christ in heaven. We honor Christ if we honor the Pope. We dishonor Christ if we dishonor the Pope. I tell you that God will and has so commanded that even if the priests and pastors of the church and Christ on earth were incarnate devils, it is seemly that we are obedient and subject to them, not for their sake, but for the sake of God, out of obedience to him, for he wills that we should act thus. Know that the Son is never in the right against the Father, even if the Father is ever so evil and unjust, for so great is the good which he has received from the Father, that is life itself, that he can never repay him for it. And we have received the life of grace from the church, which is so great a benefit that we can never by any kind of homage or gratitude pay the debt we owe." Okay. So she's saying, in the same way that, an earthly son has to follow no matter what their earthly father because their father gave them life, so too you have to follow your local priest no matter what, because he's your spiritual father and he gives you spiritual life. That's her argument. Okay? So even if your local priest is a demon, you got to obey his authority because of the institution and authority of the church. Okay. So again, I think it's, pretty well established at this point. That was her position. This is what people are referring to whenever they come back and retort. If you ever express, I don't know about following this, people will retort things like the gates of hell won't prevail, or hey, you got to follow the Pope even if it's Satan. This is where it's coming from. Okay, so let's talk about this, and let's talk about both sides. Where are people getting the idea that this is a thesis that has to be defended, and why would some others, which I think that part's going to be a little bit more obvious, why would others still say, no, there's no way, I'm not following Satan even if he were the Pope, right? Which is why I'm going to focus more on why people argue the former rather than the latter, because the latter is abundantly obvious. Okay. But before that, we hear this quote, right, from Catherine of Siena. And what if you just say, who cares what Catherine of Siena says? Well, people are going to point out that, wait, hold on. Catherine of Siena is a doctor of the church. What exactly is a doctor of the church? This is not just a saint in Catholicism, which she is a canonized saint, but this is a rare title given rarely to Catholic theologians, although there is an exception. One doctor of the church wasn't even a Catholic. He was never in communion with the Pope, oddly enough. Be that as it may, these are usually Catholic theologians who have significantly contributed to the church in their theological writings. And so the church really upholds and values their writings much more above others and really sees them as exemplifying Catholic tradition. And Catherine of Siena did write, and those are some of the things that she wrote. So, it's not something that could easily be dismissed as, who cares what she says, because she has a status of a saint and a doctor of the church, and the church has really put its approbation to a degree and in a qualified sense behind her writings, and really put forward her writings and her life, really put some backing behind that. So it can't be just quickly dismissed as, it's just kind of her opinion type of thing. Now, she was an Italian mystic, a Dominican tertiary, so she was of the Dominican order, one of the most influential women in church history. She was known for intense prayer, fasting. It said that she lived 70 years on just the Eucharist alone in service to the poor. She was a spiritual advisor to the Pope in her own day, and she actually persuaded Gregory XI, the one that we mentioned there, to return the papacy from Avignon to Rome. You remember the Babylonian captivity of the church, where you have this situation where popes chose to exercise their authority from Avignon instead of Rome, and it was a huge scandal. She, respectfully rebuked the Pope and, convinced him to return. Her major work, The Dialogue, records many of her mystical conversations with God, which let's actually talk about one of those here in just a second. She was canonized in 1461 and declared a doctor of the church in 1970, just recently. She is well known for a couple of things. You could probably see now on your screen, or my shared screen here. Catherine of Siena here with the stigmata. She's said to have had the stigmata. If you're not familiar with this is a phenomenon that started with Francis of Assisi. So it's a medieval second millennium thing where the idea is that this saint has mystically received the wounds of the crucifixion on their body. And it's part of this paradigm of them participating in the sufferings of Jesus. And, you have stigmatists from Francis of Assisi to Catherine of Siena, all the way more recently to Padre Pio. Now, of course, the critics of the church, Eastern Orthodox especially, see it as a demonic sign of prelest, of spiritual delusion and demonic validation of a demonic system. They don't believe in the stigmata. Within the Catholic paradigm, it's a sign that this person has been touched by God and is very close to God. So, there's different perspectives on it, but she's said to have had the stigmata. So, of course, if one attempts to kind of push back on what Catherine says there, the typical retort will be, well, first of all, she's a saint. Second of all, she's a doctor of the church. Third of all, she's a stigmatist. So who are you to disagree with Catherine? Type of thing. You'll probably hear that, right? Not only that, she is very famous for some of her mystical visions. She says that she had a mystical marriage to Jesus, that Jesus mystically married her. And the ring that Jesus put on her finger was made of his foreskin. Like, this is a real thing. Like, you can see this depicted in medieval art. Here's the foreskin ring that Jesus puts on the hand of Catherine of Siena. And some people are horrified by that and think that's disgusting and ridiculous. But this was a thing, like in her day and age. This was a big thing, the foreskin of Jesus. You had a lot of people claiming to have the foreskin of Jesus. Kind of like there was a lot of people who said they had the head of John the Baptist. There's like 4 heads of John the Baptist in Europe. A lot of people thought that they had, the milk of the Virgin Mary's breast, all sorts of just really wild stuff going on in medieval Europe. The foreskin of Jesus was a pretty big one. So that's probably the context behind it. And the way I've heard people attempt to explain it is that, when you receive the Eucharist, you receive all of Jesus. And, this is an intimate, mystical way of Jesus depicting that his Eucharistic flesh in the foreskin or whatever. But, there's some pretty wild stuff. If you start to look into some of the visions, some of the more mystical angle in medieval periods in the church, there's definitely some stuff that will raise an eyebrow, right? Okay, so she's well known for that. Eastern Orthodox actually bring that up pretty often to try to discredit her and say that she was completely demonically deceived and delusional. She's talking about she's being married to Jesus, and they'll argue this is like Cardinal Fernandez kissy book type of stuff, where you remember the situation with Cardinal Fernandez writing a book when he was a priest that depicts a woman having a dream of performing acts with Jesus that I can't even mention. And they'll say, look, this is that kind of stuff in the medieval period. And say that to discredit her. So these are pretty common things you'll find in these conversations about Catherine whenever you bring up some of these points. And that's why I bring it up here, so that you're aware and maybe not blindsided by that conversation, because it's going to be discussed and brought to your attention one way or another. So it's maybe good to know about it. Okay, so moving past, Catherine of Siena specifically, what about people who would, defend the thesis that one must obey Satan even if he were Pope? As ludicrous as that sounds, why would anyone defend that position? Believe it or not, they're going to use some biblical arguments for that position. But first of all, they're going to make a distinction between Satan's magisterial teachings, like his authoritative teachings of the office of the papacy, versus, and not just teachings, but also magisterial judgments, versus Satan's personal actions, private judgments, and private teachings. That's a distinction that's often made today, right? You got a distinction between what the Pope personally thinks about something as a private theologian, what he personally does in his own private spare time, versus his authoritative acts, right? There's a huge distinction that's made there. And so people will make that distinction between, if Satan occupied the office, there would be a distinction between the authoritative acts of the papacy coming from Satan versus private acts and private judgments and private teachings and private opinions of Satan. And of course, the idea is that the former are to be followed, the latter are not, right? So the magisterial teachings are to be followed, the private opinions of Satan are not. Okay, so again, some will argue this is the necessary position of the Bible. Where would they get that from? Well, Matthew 23 is going to be a big one. It's not the only one. We're going to explore quite a few. But Matthew 23:3. Let me share my screen so you can see it. This is a pretty common one that's brought up just in the conversation about, like, if you have a really bad pope, a really bad bishop, a really bad priest, 9 times out of 10, what is somebody going to tell you? To say, you still got to follow them. They'll say, Matthew 23:3, Jesus said, so you must be careful to do everything they tell you. Who's the they? The Pharisees. But do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. So they'll say, well, look, you got in Jesus's own day and age, you got Pharisees who are doing all sorts of evil, and being hypocrites and all that, not following the law of God, but claiming to. And then also teaching in their office, right? And he says that the office has the authority. So when they teach, you got to follow it, but don't do what they do because they're hypocrites. And whenever they negate it by their actions, you don't follow the actions, right? So they'll make that distinction usually in conversations about bad popes, bad bishops, bad priests. And likewise, that would obviously be applied to the case if, like, Satan became pope. They would likely bring this up. Another one is from Matthew 16:23. This is in relation to Peter. Let me pull it up here. Matthew 16:23. Jesus says this to Peter, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you, talking about his crucifixion. But he turned and said to Peter, so Jesus said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. So he called Peter Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on things of God, but on things of men. Okay. So, and notice this is Matthew 16:22 through 23. That's right before Matthew 16:18 through 19. Well, what happened in Matthew 16:18 through 19? They would point out that that's where you get the foundation for the claims of the papacy. Behold, you are Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell won't prevail against it. And whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And so he commissions him to be the first pope right there in Matthew 16:18 through 19. Gives him the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And then just a few verses later, he is the mouthpiece of Satan, right? So that will often also be brought up in these discussions. people will say, well, look, if you got a bad priest, a bad bishop, or even a bad pope, um, you know, that's okay, because Peter, the one who was commissioned to have this kind of authority, also was the mouthpiece of Satan just a few verses later. So that's to be expected. Or, he was undermining the gospel in Galatians, and Paul had to rebuke him. Or he denied Jesus, right? Before the crucifixion, denied him 3 times. And so, the very one who holds that office can also be personally a hypocrite, presumably an apostate. Interestingly enough, he didn't lose his office. Or some might say he did lose his office, and Jesus later on restored him when he said, feed my sheep, and so on. There's a little bit of a debate there. But be that as it may, he committed an act of apostasy there, right? And he was a mouthpiece of Satan, and yet he has this authority. And so they'll argue that applies to priests, bishops, popes, and presumably Satan if he were the pope. Okay, so that would be another biblical line of argumentation they would probably attempt to use. Another one that's often brought up is that Judas was a traitor, but he also had apostolic authority. Judas was given authority to cast out demons in the Gospels, and still retained an office even after his betrayal, because the apostles in Acts talk about transferring his office to Matthias, and so he still had that office, even though there was that personal element of betrayal and even possession from Satan, right? The Gospels talk about him being possessed by Satan. So people would often point to that in these conversations, and likely would do that if Satan were made a pope. Another one is 1 Samuel 2:12-36. This is that story about Eli and his wicked sons. You have these wicked priests who are doing really horrible things, sleeping with women in the temple or at the tabernacle, abusing the sacrifices, liturgical sacrifices, and yet the people still had to follow them, right? To follow the sacrificial system that was established here, right? And so they'll say, look, you even have these corrupt priests in the Old Testament, people still had to follow them, so there's a difference between, their personal acts versus the office that they hold. And again, there's that reference that we always hear repeatedly in these conversations. The gates of hell won't prevail against the church, right? That's kind of the main ultimate trump card that's slammed on the table to shut down any discussion about any type of, dissent or something like that, right? At the end of the day, the gates of hell won't prevail. So no matter what happens, gates of hell won't prevail. And this is the system, and we just got to trust the system and trust the process. So you have that one often being introduced, and I suspect if Satan were made pope, just theoretically, you would have people bring it up and say, well, look, the gates of hell won't prevail. Like, even if Satan's the pope, the gates of hell won't prevail. God will keep intact the office, even if the one who exercises the office is Satan himself. Okay. And, you do have kind of a distinction that's often made just in Catholic theology historically between personal holiness and fidelity by a cleric and the office of the cleric. You could see that with the Donatist controversy, that these wicked apostate priests can still validly confect the sacraments. So a priest, for example, who's a really horrible person, within the Catholic paradigm, can still communicate sacraments validly. He can still confect the Eucharist, still give confirmation, absolve sins, all of that. Even if he's personally in mortal sin, is a hypocrite, is wicked, is evil, is demonic, he can still do those things. And he still retains his office. Like, even if he's the worst person in the world, still retains his office until he's lawfully removed by his superior. Though this may have some limits, right? If he commits like public apostasy, just outright repudiates the Christian faith, would he still retain office until relieved by his bishop? Right? There might be a little bit of a debate there. And then the question is, does that then map on to the Pope? If a pope were to come out publicly and apostatize and renounce the Christian faith, would he cease to be pope automatically? There's a big debate on that. Some would say, yeah, he automatically loses his office. Others say no, he doesn't lose it. And really, there is no official position of the church, because the church has not anticipated in any kind of authoritative way an answer to that question. You have theologians who have entertained it, but something official from the magisterium, there's nothing in canon law. In fact, the only thing that is in canon law is canon 1404. The first see, that is Rome, is judged by no one. So if you have a pope committing apostasy, theoretically you would see some people saying, oh yeah, he's immediately lost the office of the papacy, and they got to, the cardinals need to elect somebody else. Others would say, no, he still retains the office. The first see is judged by no one. You don't get to judge him. Others will say, well, we're not judging him. He's deposed automatically by God. And others will say, that's just a theological opinion. You don't know that. And the magisterium's never said that. So I'm not going to follow you. And then there turns out to be a huge schism, those who follow the apostate pope and those who don't. So there is that angle to the conversation. What about those who oppose the thesis? Like that you don't have to follow the magisterial authority of Satan if Satan were elected the pope. Those are a little bit more obvious, right? But let's briefly explore them. So look, critics of the church especially, so non-Catholics, whether they're non-Catholic Christians or non-Catholic non-Christians, I think most critics are going to say, look, this idea that you make all these distinctions and that you would actually follow the magisterium of Satan if Satan were elected pope, this is just cultic ideology. It's a cultish, slavish way of keeping you enslaved to the church's system. It's kind of like this gaslighting, cultish way of just keeping you within this corrupt system and keeping you, supporting corrupt priests, giving your money to them, and keeping the thing going, right? And they'll point out that, look, this would basically mean that the laity still have to obey the authority of predators like the late Cardinal McCarrick, right? Notorious cardinal, known for abusing all sorts of people, and got away with it for a long time because of church cover-up and all that. And they would point out this idea of making that distinction and rigorously holding to it would mean that until Cardinal McCarrick was relieved and deposed, you would still have to follow his authority and even be required to receive the sacraments from his hands. It's not like you get to go to some schismatic community at that point and you get a pass on that because it's Cardinal McCarrick. Now, there is the element of maybe you can move to another diocese or something like that. But if you don't have that opportunity, you would have to go to a person like that to receive the sacraments. And that's going to be a tough pill to swallow for the people who have been abused by Cardinal McCarrick. Could you imagine telling one of the victims of Cardinal McCarrick, hey, yeah, sorry, you got to make this hardline distinction between office and personal character. And so if you want to receive the sacraments or you want to receive confession, you got to go to Cardinal McCarrick and his team. I mean, can you imagine? It's a tough pill to swallow, and people are going to point that out, right? And they'll also point out there are cases where one may disobey church authority. Thomas Aquinas talks about this. He speaks about instances where you can disobey versus instances where you cannot disobey. He says when an authority imposes on his subjects burdensome laws, which are conducive not to the common good, but rather to his own greediness or vainglory, then you can disobey. Or when a man makes a law that goes beyond the power committed to him, ultra vires. Or when burdens are imposed unequally on the community, although with a view to the common good, in those cases you could disobey. Or whenever a prelate, an authority in the church, commands you to do something that's sinful, that's forbidden by a higher authority, like forbidden by divine law. So if a pope told you to go and murder somebody, do you have to obey that? Aquinas is going to say, no, of course you don't, because that violates the higher law that God has given, right? So there are cases where you can disobey, but Aquinas is going to argue But when they're not doing that, even if they're the worst person in the world, worst hypocrite in the world, most evil person in the world, you still got to obey their authority. Of course, a lot of the critics are going to just say, look, this is delusional pope-splaining that's there to defend a satanic pope and defend a satanic system, right? And so, like I said, I mean, the objections are going to be a lot more obvious than those that are there to support the thesis. Okay, so those are just a few points from both sides. Now, let's briefly talk about Our Lady of La Salette, because I know inevitably that's going to be brought up in the comment section to this conversation. This was an apparition that occurred over a century ago in La Salette, and parts of it were approved and parts were rejected and actually are on the Index of Forbidden Books, but most people don't know that. And what you'll often hear people say, well, look, Our Lady, this is supposed to be the Virgin Mary, of La Salette, says, quote, Rome will lose the faith and become the seat of Antichrist, end quote. That will often be brought up. And so some people might say, you know, you might have a situation like this where you got a pope who is actually Satan on the papal throne, or maybe the Antichrist on a papal throne, because you got this deal from Our Lady of La Salette. So you may have a case like this, and you got to go ahead and prepare for it. I will point out, as I have done numerous times, the part there, Rome will lose the faith and become the seat of the Antichrist. Number one, when it says Rome there, that could just be the people of Rome, not necessarily the Pope, but let's just assume it means the Pope. What a lot of people don't know is, even though the Our Lady of La Salette apparition was approved, that part was not part of the original approved apparition. The part, Rome will lose the faith and become the seat of the Antichrist. That was added by the visionary later, and the papacy never approved of that added part from the visionary. In fact, it rejected it and put it on the Index of Forbidden Books. So ironically, you'll often hear traditionalist Catholics present that Rome will lose the faith and become the seat of the Antichrist. And ironically, they're presenting something that's on the Index of Forbidden Books. But they usually just don't know that, right? So this part wasn't approved, but it does create a problem with the legitimacy of the person who's offering the revelation, right? I mean, it's odd that on the one hand, the very voice that has a vision of the Virgin Mary and it's approved is another voice that's deceiving people with false visions and false apparitions. And for that reason, some people have called into question Rome's judgment on approving Our Lady of La Salette. You can hear some popular Catholic apologists who have tacitly done that. Okay. Now, some might say, this is just still theoretical, right? Something like that would never happen. Well, look, I did a whole video at rtcourses.com. The worst pope in history, John XII, and the council that removed him. This is one of those bad popes in history, right? There's a lot of them. This is definitely one who's maybe top 10, right? John XII, according to the council, the cardinals who deposed him, which is the whole thing in and of itself, did they have the authority to depose him? Some will say, no, that's the heresy of conciliarism. That's getting bad against Vatican I. Others will say, yeah, it was legitimate. I discussed that in the lecture, but be that as it may, one of the reasons why he was deposed is because the Pope murdered people during his pontificate. I mean, in fact, when the cardinals held, along with the emperor, held in Rome a council to depose him or remove him from the papacy, to pay them back, he comes to Rome and murders some of the cardinals who did that and tortured others. He fornicated with people's wives. It's said that he died in bed with a man's wife, and the way he died was the man caught him in bed with his wife and killed him. In the process, others say it wasn't a woman, it was a man that he was in bed with. Be that as it may. He was definitely known for fornication, incest, engaged in a lot of incest. turned the Vatican into a brothel. That was another one of the accusations. And also was known for toasting to the devil. That was a big accusation made against him in his trial to depose him. He was toasting to Satan. So John the 12th wasn't Satan himself, but he was very satanic in many ways, right? And yet he was on the papal throne. Again, there's some dispute on was he legitimately deposed, or is that the heresy of conciliarism? The standard response is going to be, well, the council that deposed him, it's not legit because that's the heresy of conciliarism, so he still retained office, which just kind of proves the point all the more. Here you have the case of, a satanic pope, but he legitimately exercises authority. And so whenever he taught in his magisterium, people had to follow it. The man who just got done sleeping with someone's wife, murdering some other cardinals, torturing others, toasting to the devil, picks up a pen and writes a magisterial document, and you got to follow it. So you may not have had the case like so far of a satanic pope, literally. You don't have Satan as the pope, to my knowledge, yet, right? But you have had satanic-like popes, and so that has happened before. We have seen that in church history. So it's not just a theoretical question. It's kind of one that one has to already explore. Does one have to acknowledge John the 12th as a legitimate pope? And if you were alive at the time, would you have to follow his magisterium when he's doing all this wild stuff? Now, very technically, there is no official magisterial list of who are proper popes, who are anti-popes. A lot of people are scandalized by that. They don't even know it. It's one of those things. There's no official list of infallible teachings or ex-cathedra teachings. There's no official list. You have lists put together by theologians. You have particular instances that might be recognized by popes. You do have that. And you do have cases where popes may have recognized another pope as legit. Yes, you have cases like that. But do you have an official list breaking down who are all the legitimate popes and all the anti-popes in a list that's produced by the magisterium and thus authoritative? No, you don't have that. There isn't even an official list like that of ecumenical councils, although you might point to some of the acts from Vatican II that list 21 ecumenical councils, but I don't think they tell you which ones, right? But you do have a lot of theologians that will tell you like which are approved ecumenical councils and what is papal ex cathedra and what's not. And you do have like private theologians who do that. But there is no official list. But I think most would have recognized John the 12th was a legitimate pope, even after he was deposed. And they would just say the deposing of the pope was illegitimate. I think most would take that position. So it raises that problem and shows that this isn't just kind of a theoretical question. And it does have real life applications. Let me give you a couple examples. So if you know that your priest, at your local parish, and you don't have the opportunity to move and go somewhere else, your local priest is an evil person. Like if you know that, and if he is, and the bishop knows about it and he's on board with it and he's not going to do anything about it. He's covering it up, in fact. Do you still go to his mass, or do you just say, oh, I don't have to go to mass anymore? Or if your bishop teaches, do you say, I don't have to listen to the bishop anymore? Or do you say, well, I still got to follow his magisterium? Or the bishop says, hey, you can't go to that SSPX mass down the road. Do you say, well, I got to follow the bishop because it's his authority, even though he's a hypocrite and a disgusting person, I still have to follow the office? Or do you say, no, I'm not doing that. I know what the bishop just did with this little boy, or I know what this priest did with this little boy. I'm not going to any of their masses. I'm not following any of that, right? So it has real life consequences, especially if you're the victim of some of the acts of a priest or a bishop, or maybe your child is a victim, right? What do you do? This is a conversation that has real life application, because the question of Satan occupying the papal office, the answers in that conversation are the same answers in the conversation to what if your priest is demonic and corrupt? What if your bishop is demonic and corrupt? Does that then give you license to do this, or does it not? And it has real life consequences and application. It raises the question: how far will one go with the obedience thing? Right? You have this notion of obedience to lawful authority. We saw where Jesus talked about that. We see that discussed in the Bible. Even if the authority is evil, right? We see Aquinas talking about this, many people talking about it. But how far will that go, right? For most people who are experiencing abuse at the hands of horrible clergy or are scandalized by bad clergy, how far will that go? Will it go to the point where one would say, yeah, if the devil were Pope, I would follow the devil's magisterium? Or would they say, no, I'm out at that point? Now, if they say I'm out at that point, okay, look, I totally understand why somebody would take that position. But here's my question to you. Upon what basis then do you say that someone like John the 12th had a legitimate magisterium, right? This is where it has real life consequences. Upon what basis would you say, okay, I would follow John the 12th, but I wouldn't follow Satan? Now you might say, well, this is a fundamental difference between a satanic-like pope and Satan himself. Yeah, I understand, but practically it's going to shake down to the same thing. They're both incredibly evil, right? And so you're going to end up in that conundrum of this tension between the office and scandalized by the occupant of the office. And so if you say, I'm out, if, Satan were elected Pope, my question is, why aren't you out when John the 12th was elected Pope? Is my question. Now, if one says that they can disobey lawful commands of Satan if he were the Pope, then my question is, then can't Catholics do that with popes who deviate from the faith? And if not, upon what basis? So if you say, I can if Satan is elected Pope and he teaches something ex cathedra, I don't have to follow that ex cathedra teaching. Okay, but so upon what basis would you say, I'm not going to follow it in that case? But in other cases where you have a pope who deviates from the faith and is, as a private theologian, and then he teaches something ex cathedra, upon what basis would you say I would follow it in that case, but not in this case, right? I'm looking for a consistent position, and you'll see why here in a moment. Now, on the flip side, if you choose the other option, if one says they do have to obey the lawful commands of Satan if he were pope, then it leads to the conclusion that God allows Satan to be God's divine voice of guidance on earth, which a lot of people would conclude to be absurd, right? I mean, how do you have Satan as your mouthpiece? It is a legitimate concern. I understand. Now, if this were the case, wouldn't God require too much of his people at that point? If God's messenger doesn't believe the divine message, in this case, the messenger would be Satan, why would God expect his flock to obey the divine message? And how are people to recognize the voice of the divine on earth when it comes from the mouth of Satan? But I think you still have that question in the Gospels, right? Because we saw Peter. So I don't think it's just a theoretical thing. I think it's something that is a tension that we can find going all the way back to the Bible. Now, as far as a conclusion to this, what do I think about this? As far as the paradigm that we have, the structure of ecclesiology that we have within the church, within Catholicism, I don't see anything that would allow someone to disobey the authentic magisterium of someone, even if it were occupied by Satan. And that's disturbing to me. So for better or worse, I don't see anything within the Catholic structure of ecclesiology that would allow a person to say you could disobey the lawful papal authority and exercise thereof by an occupant such as Satan. Again, that's disturbing to me. That's not something I say lightly. That's very disturbing to me. Because in reality, a person would come back and say, but look, Peter was given that authority, and then he's the voice of Satan. and in all those biblical instances we mentioned earlier. And upon what basis do you say, okay, yeah, that's true in that case, but over here in this case, no? I don't see anything to guard against this idea other than other than somebody just simply saying, well, okay, technically there's nothing within the Catholic paradigm that would, you know, allow you to disobey the authority of somebody who's occupied the throne of Peter in that situation. There's nothing there that would allow for that kind of dissent against lawful authority, but God would never allow it to happen because it would be unfitting. Which, okay, I understand, like, that's an argument from providence, right? God would just never providentially allow this situation. But, you know, the issue with the argument from providence, you know, there was a time when people thought God would never providentially allow a John the 12th to be on the papal throne. There was a time when they felt there would never be a Liberius. Liberius was the one who was under pressure, who signed a semi-Arian creed. People say it's not authoritative because it was under pressure. But there was a time when people thought that would never happen. God would never allow that providentially. And yet it happened. There was a time people thought there would never be a murderous, fornicating, toasting to the devil pope on the papal throne. And yet it happened. So when it comes to an appeal to, well, God would just never allow it, I don't know. God's allowed some things that people just thought would never happen before. So I don't know how far that will really get one down the road. Which leads to me to this conclusion that this is a very serious difficulty, and again has real life applications and consequences, as I'm mentioning here. And I don't see anything within Catholic ecclesiology that accounts for it. That I'm aware of. Now, you might be aware of something that accounts for it, and please feel free to contribute that. I would love to hear it. I'm not omniscient. I don't know everything. You know something about the magisterium and ecclesiology that accounts for this situation, I'm all ears. I'm just telling you what I know so far. And so I don't see anything that would prevent this kind of situation, or and that's not to say that this will happen. I'm just saying I don't see anything that would prevent it. And I don't see anything that's in place right now canonically or in the church's ecclesiology that would allow a person to disobey the authentic magisterial expressions of an occupant of the papacy, even if it were Satan occupying it. And again, that's a disturbing point to me. But again, like I say, I don't know everything. If you know something, please let me know. I want to remind y'all, by the way, hit that subscribe button if you appreciate this conversation, kind of going over both angles of this, exploring all angles here, and trying to have a good and hard and candid look at the conversation. If you appreciate that kind of content, hit the subscribe button and hit the like button. I want to remind you, by the way, of that course I was just telling you about, the worst pope in history. I talk a little bit more about John the 12th and the council that removed him. Go and check it out. And once you purchase that, as well as the lecture that I have next Saturday on papal infallibility, understanding papal infallibility, what it is, what is the history behind it, and what are some difficulties to the question of papal infallibility, as well as some potential responses to the difficulties. If you purchase that course, $24.99, it's on discount right now. You get the early bird discount before October 25th. Once you purchase it, you'll get another 30% off my Magisterium courses. So if you want to understand what the Magisterium is, the teaching authority of the church, understand how it works, how it operates, and its history, you get 30 lectures that I offer at the university level. It's already at a discounted price because I bundled them together. But if you get the Understanding Papal Infallibility lecture, it will give you another 30% off. And that's going to be available until October 25th. So take advantage of it while you still have that opportunity. Okay, so those are my thoughts on the matter. But then again, like I said, I'm not omniscient. So I would love to hear, what do you think? What do you think? You know, if Satan were to become Pope, I want to hear from you, especially if you're a Catholic, right? I know I have non-Catholic viewers, but if you're a Catholic, would you follow the magisterium of Satan even if he were Pope? I want a candid yes or no to that in the comment section. And by the way, if you're not a Catholic, I still want to hear from you as well, but kind of let me know in the comment section. Not a Catholic here, but here's my view. Or if you are Catholic, say, I'm a Catholic, here's my view. I want to hear from you. I want to see what are your thoughts. And also, if you think I'm missing something in this conversation, contribute that in the comment section as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts and your feedback on it. All right, that's going to do it for today. We'll see you later. Thanks so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe. And for a deeper dive, check out my courses at rtcourses.com and my Patreon channel at patreon.com/reason and theology.